Hey, Milky here, back again with another video for MarvelSNAP. Before we get into any of today's content, I wanted to give a huge shout out to our friend Drewberry. He recently dropped a video featuring a number of content creators around the MarvelSNAP scene. We were lucky enough to be featured on there, so I'm super grateful for that. He also does a ton of work in terms of building community around MarvelSNAP and goes a ways to reaching out to content creators and helping build their channels as well. So thanks so much to him for the huge shout out, the continued support of all content creators, and the community that is really driving around MarvelSNAP. It's so awesome to see. Today's video is really going to focus in on the best decks you can build in Pool 1 in MarvelSNAP. If you're brand new playing the game for the first time from global release, welcome to the game. This is an unreal game. I really hope you enjoy. So with all that being said, let's get in and take a look at some of these decks now. Before we get into the first deck, a quick rundown on what you're actually seeing on your screen. Up here we have a deck highlight which captures all of the cards in the deck that we'll be talking about. Below that you have yours truly, and over here we have the core cards within that deck. These are really fundamental cards within the deck which really revolve around what the goal of the deck is trying to achieve. It's really tough to play the deck without these cards, so make sure you include these cards in the deck when you're trying to play kind of any version of these decks. So we kick things off with what I think is the number one, the first place Pool 1 deck, which is a Zoo Boost deck. This is a swarm style deck which floods the board with lots of 1-drops and cheap cards and then tries to boost up their power later on in the game. First up we have Ant-Man, and I want to say this early on, but Ant-Man is in a lot of Pool 1 decks because he is such a strong 1-drop. With these types of decks, you really want to flood the board and you're adding lots of cards to the location, so his ongoing ability is really easy to complete, making him a single cost but 4 power card, which is super strong for him in all of these decks. We then have Hawkeye, and Hawkeye is a bit of a flavor pick for me. You can really sub in any 1-drop that you want into this deck and it can do quite well. Hawkeye does telegraph a little bit where you're actually going to be playing a card next turn if you want to complete his on reveal ability, but he's a solid 3 power addition to the board all the same. We then continue on with lots of other 1-drops which are really going to seek to flood the board, and Squirrel Girl does that better than most. She adds a single power card to all 3 locations. I would recommend maybe holding her back in your hand and playing other 1-drops first until you see what all the locations are, but she's a great way to add power across the board. Korg is a great card in this deck. Negatively affects your opponent's deck. Shuffling a rock in there adds 2 power to your own board while also filling a really good spot in terms of being a 1-drop that can be activated and boosted later. Nightcrawler, 1-drop that can be boosted and moved to any location. Really strong card in this deck. Yondu's got an awesome on reveal ability. It says remove, but it actually destroys the top card of your opponent's deck, which they can't play anymore. This can really disrupt combo decks and put a spanner in the works of what they're trying to do. So he's really strong card in terms of playing power out on the board, but also disrupting what your opponent's trying to do. Angela, easily one of the strongest and most versatile 2-drops in the game. Any deck where you're looking to play out lots of cards, Angela is a go-to. She can represent up to 7 power on the board if you stack cards at a single location. She's super strong and you'll see her in a ton of decks. Mr. Fantastic, a great way to spread power across the board without actually playing cards there. He will add 2+ power to each of the adjacent locations. He's often best played in the middle. Captain America is a great card when you're stacking lots of cards at locations. He will boost up all the cards at a single location. He can also be reactivated by Onslaught, which is going to be a really strong push at a single location. We then get into the first of the core cards in this deck, and this is Kazar. Because we play so many 1-drops in this deck, Kazar is super key in terms of boosting them up by 1 power, and you can drop him on turn 4 and potentially double down on that later on in the game. Blue Marvel is the second core card in this deck, and with a recent buff moving him from 6 cost to 5 cost, he is so much more playable now and actually a really strong card in a lot of decks now. Because you can play him on turn 5 now and Onslaught on turn 6 to double down on his ability, he can add a lot of power across the board in the space of just a few short turns. So lastly, we have the king of doubling down on ongoing effects, who is Onslaught. We have a number of really key ongoing effects in this deck which can boost up the rest of your board or a single location, and Onslaught can double down on all of those effects. An ideal location might look something like Ant-Man or Captain America, followed by Kazar, Blue Marvel, and Onslaught, who's going to provide an insane amount of power not only to that single location, but also to the rest of your board by boosting up with Blue Marvel and Kazar. He provides not only 7 power, but an insane ongoing ability, which is really rounds out the core of this deck. The final thing I want to say about this deck, which makes it insanely strong in Pool 1, is that later on in Pool 2, a card comes into the game called Killmonger, who has the ability to destroy all single cost cards. But he's not in the game at Pool 1. So you can freely play out lots of your cards and boost them up with these crazy ongoing abilities, which can provide real success in the game. This was actually the first deck that I ran all the way to Infinite when I first started playing MarvelSNAP back in my first season. I actually also ran a version of this deck in a more recent season all the way to Infinite as well. So for me, it's been super successful. Getting into what I consider to be the number 2, second best Pool 1 deck, which is the Odin on reveal deck. So as in the title, this deck really revolves around the on reveal mechanic. We have some cards with really strong on reveal abilities, which we can activate and potentially reactivate later in the game to get some really good benefits for us as we play out our cards on the board. First up, we have Electra, who's a really strong 1-drop, which can kind of disrupt what your opponent's doing on the board. She destroys an enemy 1-cost card, and you can potentially play that early or late in the game depending on the situation. Next up we have Nightcrawler, and he's a great flex pick in this deck. He can often move into locations where you can't actually directly play cards, and you can get some sneaky power over there as you play out this deck, so he's a really versatile pick as well. Next up we have Rocket Raccoon, who has a strong on-reveal effect if you can activate it. Sometimes it is a bit of guesswork, but if you're playing your opponent and potentially playing this card a little bit later on the game, you can often get that on-reveal effect much more consistently. We then have Cable, and Cable is a really strong card because it actually steals a card from your opponent's deck. Not only are you getting information about the deck your opponent's playing early on in the game, but you're also potentially taking one of their key cards or key combo pieces, which can really put an end to exactly what the opponent's trying to do. So Cable's a super strong card that you can play out early on in the game. Mr. Sinister's a really strong card at 2-drop. He represents 4 power on the board, which is spread over 2 cards. So he does take up 2 board slots, but I think the power that he offers and also his versatility in terms of flooding locations is a really kind of strong place for him to be at in this deck. Scarlet Witch is a flavor pick of mine in this deck, and I think early on, especially in the game, locations can be really detrimental to the deck and the play style that you want to play. Scarlet Witch offers an ability to flip that location and change it into something else. It is completely random, but I think you having the power in your hand to change a location, which could be really bad for you, is super strong, and that's why she's in the deck. And I find that she works quite well, especially early on in the game. Ironheart is one of those core cards in this deck where you want to activate her on reveal ability, but then also reactivate it. It's important to try and get the most out of Ironheart, meaning that you have at least 3 other cards on the board at any point in time before you play her, so you can get that maximum of 6 power spread across the cards, and then ideally she's a great target for Odin later on in the game to reactivate those abilities as well. Wolfsbane is a great 3-drop who represents a really strong push on a single location. If you already have 3 cards on a location, and Wolfsbane is the 4th card, she can represent 7 power added to that location in 1 hit for only 3 cost, which is really, really strong. You can also potentially double activate Wolfsbane's ability by doubling down with Odin as a 4th card later if she is the 3rd card played or the 2nd card played. So she's quite versatile in locking down a single location and does really well at that. White Tiger is another core card in this deck. Her on-reveal ability shoots out a 7 power tiger to another location. It is random, but it is quite a strong push. It can also allow you to get additional power into locations where you might not be able to reach it. Things like the Sanctum Sanctorum or Death's Domain, you can actually get power into that location easily by activating her Tiger ability. She's also a fantastic target for Odin later on in the game, where you can reactivate that Tiger ability and get more Tigers out on the board. Gamora is another flavor pick of mine and something that got a recent buff. She can go all the way up to 12 power if you're able to activate her on-reveal ability, which I think makes it an insanely strong card if you can do that. Later on in the game, it is also much more predictable as to where your opponent's playing. So you can definitely get some really strong plays with Gamora late on in the game. And if you're looking to lock down a single location, you might even be able to reactivate her ability with Odin, which just sends her over the top. Spider-Woman is an awesome card to drop when you are fighting your opponent for a single location. Sometimes you'll find in the game you are back and forth with your opponent fighting over a location. dropping Spider-Woman, negatively affecting their board, boosting yours up by 7 can be a really strong push in your favor. And you can potentially even double down on that with Odin later on in the game and reactivate that on-reveal ability. Rounding out the deck, we have the All-Father himself, Odin, and Odin's ability reactivates all of the on-reveal abilities at a single location. That's why we have cards like Ironheart, White Tiger, Wolfsbane, Spider-Woman, Gamora, all these cards with really, really strong on-reveal effects. We can double down on that and reactivate them with Odin on that location. If you're trying to win a single location, you can reactivate those abilities that are strong at a single location. I've found the strongest play line is to play Ironheart and White Tiger on a single location, and then you slam Odin later in the game for a huge power push across the board and to spread power that way. He's a really versatile card, which helps you win a lot of games, and he's a core card in this deck when playing it. So rounding things out with number 3, the third best deck, but what I think is the funnest deck by far in Pool 1 is the Devil Dinosaur Handsize deck. So the real goal of this deck, and why it's called Handsize, is that you want to continually be adding cards to your hand through on-reveal effects or different mechanics in the game, and then finish the game with the largest hand size you can possible. A version of this deck actually used to be one of the strongest decks in the game, especially early on, but with nerfs and card changes that has changed a little bit, but it's still a really, really strong deck which can be consistent in helping you climb early on in the game. Here he is again, Ant-Man. Don't have to repeat what I've said. He's a really strong card which helps you fill out locations. Mantis is a great card, but takes a little bit of guesswork. Her on-reveal ability is actually super powerful for a one-drop, where you actually take a card from your opponent's deck and you draw that card, meaning it's removed and stolen from their deck. But you want to make sure you get that on-reveal ability, so try and play it a little bit later on once you've figured out where your opponent's going to be playing. We've talked about Cable and his ability to steal a card from the bottom of your opponent's deck. Again, a super powerful card in this deck, reducing what your opponent's doing, adding it to your hand, getting information. He's a really strong card. Sentinel is an awesome card in this deck because of his repeatability in terms of playing. Every time you play a Sentinel, you add another Sentinel to your hand, which not only adds to your hand size, but if you're looking on filling out curves on certain turns, you can continue to play him out and get that benefit of the on-reveal effect. Punisher for me is the first flavor pick in this deck. Because you are playing a fair number of cards out on the board and expecting your opponent to potentially do so as well, Punisher can come down and actually punish that location, so to speak, by adding power to your hand for the amount of cards that they have there. I actually just like the card. I like this variant. I think he's a really interesting card, so that's why I've got him in here. Captain America, again, great when you're flooding lots of locations and adding lots of cards to single locations, so he's in there just to boost up the rest of the power of the cards there. Moon Girl is the first core card in this deck, coming in at a 4-drop. She has a super interesting on-reveal ability, which is to duplicate your hand. MarvelSNAP only allows you to have 7 cards in your hand at any one point in time. That means that if you have 7 cards in your hand and you play Moon Girl, you won't duplicate anything. Hand size and the position of the cards in your hand is really important when playing Moon Girl. If you're playing Moon Girl and you have 5 cards in your hand and only a couple of spots left over, she'll only duplicate the first 2 cards. So just be aware of that when you're playing Moon Girl. A really good target for Moon Girl in this deck is Devil Dinosaur. You want him in the front of your hand and you're able to duplicate and get a second one potentially for turn 6. Can be a really, really strong push on the board. For me, White Queen is the second core card in this deck and an absolute sleeper pick. I think she is so underrated for what she actually gives you at 4 cost. She gives you a really strong 6 power, which is a great push onto the board by itself, but her on-reveal ability also draws you a copy of the highest cost card in your opponent's hand. This is not just so you get a copy of the card, and that's really powerful in itself, but you get information about how they're going to play out their final turns or how they're potentially going to do that. It's a really, really strong card, which I think is core in this deck in terms of playing against your opponent and reading what they're trying to do. Iron Man comes in at 5-drop, an absolutely broken card in this game, especially as you move into the later pools, but his ongoing ability doubles the power at a single location. It's a great way to win a single location and lock it down, potentially what you're trying to do with Devil Dino on one location and maybe a big power push on another. Devil Dinosaur is the third core card that I have in this deck. As I said earlier, you want to keep your hand size as large as you can by the end of the game. Devil Dinosaur really benefits from that. He has an ongoing ability, so as you play out cards or add cards to your hand, this will continually change. His power will change out through every single turn. So by the final turn, you want to have the maximum amount of cards you can in your hand, which can take him all the way up to a 17 power card, which is a huge push at 5 cost. Onslaught is definitely a flavor pick for me. It's something that I've found pretty successful playing this deck early on. You can definitely sub him out for another card if you like, or if you like something else at 6 drop for sure. I think he works really well with Devil Dino if you're looking to absolutely blow away location. Also Iron Man, Captain America, Punisher, they all benefit from the ongoing buff that he gives, which boosts and double down on their ongoing abilities as well. The final card in this deck for me is America Chavez. She's kind of fallen off out of the meta a fair bit over time, but I think she's a really strong pick at 6 spot, especially in this deck. In this deck, you really want to draw your cards early on, like Devil Dino, other draw cards to keep your hand size really full. America Chavez guarantees that you'll draw her on turn 6, and most of the time you're never actually going to be playing her. She does represent a bit of a power push at 9 power onto the board, but the thing that she does is she pushes all the cards to be drawn earlier in the deck. She actually doesn't really take up a deck slot at all between 1 to 5 energy, which means that they are freed up for other cards in your deck, making the percentages that you're actually going to be drawing those cards a bit higher. So I think the consistency that she brings to the deck in terms of her ability is something that can definitely be looked at. She's probably a card that you can sub out if you don't like playing America Chavez, but for me, I like the consistency that she brings. Final thoughts on this deck for me is that it's a super fun deck. If you can get a duplicate on Devil Dino with Moon Girl, it can be an awesome way to spread a ton of power across the board later on in the game, and a really unexpected push which your opponent can't really predict. So we also have a couple of Pool 1 runner-up decks, which I really want to highlight. I don't think these are quite as strong as the first 3 that I kind of mentioned as being the top 3 Pool 1 decks, but these definitely have a place in the meta. They can be really easy to build with Pool 1 cards and can have a strong place in climbing as well. So definitely try them out if you do have the cards for sure. So the first Pool 1 runner-up deck that we have is the Apocalypse discard deck, which really revolves around discarding Apocalypse as many times as you can throughout the game, and then playing him out on turn 6 for a really high power. Each time you discard Apocalypse, he gets +4 power, which is really strong, and if you're able to potentially get a little lucky while also playing out some key cards, you can add a lot of power to this card for a big turn 6 play. The other key card in the deck is Lady Sif, which is really going to focus on discarding Apocalypse. So you want Apocalypse in your hand before you play Lady Sif to guarantee that you're going to discard Apocalypse and add that 4+ power to him. The other 2 key cards in this deck, and I think Blade is probably the most important of the 2, is Blade, which discards a random card in your hand, and also Swordmaster, which also discards a random card in your hand. They're good power pushers on the board, but their discard is random, which means you might discard Apocalypse, you might just discard something else. So it can be a little bit hit or miss as to playing these cards out. Another great card to play in this deck is Wolverine. He benefits from discarding as he can be played out for free on the board, albeit to a random location, but getting 3 power out on the board for free is definitely not a bad thing, so worth an inclusion in this deck. Another runner-up deck that I have, and a really strong deck for Pool 1 in its own right, is Ongoing Spectrum. A lot of people would actually have this in their top 3, if not their top 1. It is a really strong deck in its own right, and I can see why, but for me, the single point of failure in this deck is drawing Spectrum. It's really heavily reliant on drawing Spectrum as a card. Now there are other win conditions in the deck. Iron Man can really provide a strong push for a single location. Claw and Mr. Fantastic can provide a sneaky push of power to locations which they aren't on. Captain America, Punisher can provide a really strong ongoing effects around boosting up a single location. But I think without Spectrum, and when I didn't draw Spectrum, it felt a little bit lackluster. When you do draw Spectrum, you absolutely wipe the floor with a lot of decks, and you can get some very strong wins out there. But I think without Spectrum, it didn't feel quite as strong or consistent as the other decks in my top 3. In saying that, it's absolutely a super deck for Pool 1 and definitely something you should try out and see if it's successful for you. The core cards in this deck are Spectrum, which provides a +2 power to all of your ongoing cards on the board. It also Iron Man, which is a great way to win a single location and boost up a lot of power there. And finally Claw, which is a great way to push power to multiple locations from a single card. So that wraps up what I think are the best 3 decks for Pool 1, as well as 2 very worthy runner-ups. Now we're going to give them a crack at infinite rank and see how they go. Okay, so this time around we have the Pool 1 Boost deck, which really involves a lot of 1-drops and looking to boost them up with cards like Kazar and Blue Marvel. We go into Elysium, which is a pretty good location for us. We're going to have lots of cards that are going to cost 0. So we can actually kind of just hold, and we can wait and see what the later locations are going to be. Elysium kind of, making cards cost 0 gives us that kind of freedom. So we do go into Shadowland, which isn't all that bad for us, especially seeing as though we have Kazar. I might go ahead and get out Captain America though, and then we can pass the turn. This deck has been super successful for me. It's actually the deck that I first ran all the way to Infinite when I made Infinite in the first season of playing MarvelSNAP. So for me, it's been an incredibly consistent deck and something that just kind of works. It's kind of out of the box. It does what it says it does, which is kind of consistently boost up cards. And the really cool thing about this deck as well, and I'll play Kazar over on Captain America here. The really cool thing about Kazar, the really cool thing about this deck is that because it runs so many 1-drops, there's a card called Killmonger, which destroys all 1-drops that are on the board. But Killmonger actually doesn't enter the game until Pool 2. So while you're in Pool 1, this deck's actually really safe from Killmonger, and I would think it's probably the #1 deck, potentially, in Pool 1. Super consistent deck. You can do a lot with it as well. We have so much power that we can play here, but I think we're just going to continue to hold. This location, we might get a Blue Marvel and an Onslaught, so we actually don't need to do anything this turn because we have so many cards that cost 0. So we're versing a Patriot deck, which is a pretty strong deck at the moment, for sure. They do get a lot of kind of buffs out on the board, being a Patriot deck, but we'll see how we go. I don't know if we're going to be able to win this one against a Patriot deck. They do get they end up buffing the board with minions that don't have abilities, so they're quite a strong deck for sure. But again, we probably don't need to play anything here. We can really flood the board on the final turn. A White Tiger, interesting. So there's a slightly different version of a Patriot deck, I guess. What we probably should have done last turn is played out Nightcrawler on Angela and then moved him away, but that's okay. I think this is going to be the strongest play we can make. We can throw out Hawkeye just for laughs. But let's go ahead and lock it in. I don't know if we win this, but we'll see. So they're snapping on us, which means that they probably have Onslaught. And Onslaught does beat us. It doesn't beat us in left, but it beats us in right. Okay, so no Onslaught. Interesting, okay. We might actually win this one in left lane. We might actually win this one, sorry, in right lane. We do have a ton of power in left. All our 1-drops are going to get boosted up. We're going to hit Angela a bunch of times. Yeah, we're gonna take this one out. So that's against a Pool 3 deck in Infinite at the moment, and we do get out the win. Just able to absolutely flood the board on turn 6 there, with Elysium as the location, and holding our cards close to our chest ended up paying off. So awesome 4-cube win there. Let's go on to the next. Okay, so getting into this one. One thing to note is also that we're playing these Pool 1 decks I'm currently at Infinite rank, so the games are definitely going to be probably a little bit tougher, potentially at Infinite than they might be when you enter the game. So that's just something to note, as well as lots of the cards you're going to be seeing. You're not going to be seeing these cards when you first enter the game, because lots of these are going to be in kind of Pool 2, Pool 3 decks making up these for sure. So he played out Nightcrawler turn 1 onto Shadowland. We can move him around anywhere we want. Hell's Kitchen pulls out our Electra for us, and we don't have a really strong turn this turn, but I think Cable is just fine. We also get a bit of a look at their deck with Cable, because it steals a card from the bottom of their deck, so we can get a bit more insight as to exactly what they're playing here. Okay, and the negative zone. The negative zone's a pretty tough location in this deck. The combos that we're really looking for in this deck is White Tiger and Ironheart, followed by an Odin on turn 6. But I think we can start getting out some other cards here potentially. See if we can push a little bit of power onto the board ahead of that turn. Those later turns in the game. So we do get rewarded with the Rocket Raccoon. It was a good guess. Scorpion is pretty brutal for us. Slaps our hand with a -1 on everything here. So I'm thinking if we do draw Odin, we have a nice play here with Ironheart that we can make, and potentially White Tiger. We can Odin, White Tiger, and potentially get a lot of power across the board. So I'm thinking we go after that. I'd also love to play Electro over here to try and ping off this Sunspot, but I think the detriment of taking out their -2 Ninja, which is also a 1 cost, isn't what we want to go for at this stage. So I think just Ironheart, and then we can move on. Okay, so they get out Miles Morales. Interesting. So we don't have an Odin yet, which means our plays are going to be relatively weak. I think this is still going to be the best, and then we can move out Nightcrawler somewhere else. Let's go ahead and make this play. Could have also played Gamora, but he's obviously not going to play. Not going to play into the Gamora, which we could get a good on-reveal effect, but he's not going to play into it because he's got Daredevil out on the board, which means he reads our turn 5 ahead of what we actually do, and then he can make his play after reading that. So he's probably going to lock down the negative zone with Professor X. Yep, as expected. That's a very common combo you'll see later on in the game, is Daredevil to read the turn on play 5, and then Professor X locks down a lane where you can't actually play cards there anymore. But it's not too bad for us, I don't think. So we have a few options here. We can White Tiger, or I actually like the Gamora play. So we end up actually getting the victory here. We had some really strong early game turns with Wolfsbane and Ironheart. We also got a really good pick with Rocket Raccoon, having a really good guess there, as well as just playing out the cards that we had. I think our final turn there would have probably been to move Nightcrawler across like I had, then play Gamora in, because it seems like they were probably going to go after this location. But yeah, that's a win with the on-reveal deck at infinite level. Hopefully it performs well for you. Let me know how it goes. Okay, so this time we have the Pool 1 Handsize deck, which personally I think is the funnest of the Pool 1 decks. I think it just gives it a lot of variety in the way that you play it. It's got some really interesting play lines with cards like Moon Girl and Devil Dino. So for me, it's one of the funnest decks that you can play in Pool 1. But yeah, it's a strong deck for sure. And we do go into X-Mansion. So I'm going to take the Mantis roll. Hopefully we can hit. Unlucky. They don't play anything this turn, but that's fine. 2 power out on the board's not too bad at all. We can follow that up with a Cable on turn 2, which I might play into Monster Metropolis, start spreading across the board a little bit. Yeah, I think this deck's a load of fun. I don't think it's quite as consistent as some of the other decks on the list that I have, but this deck actually gets a lot stronger when you play it into through Pool 2. So in Pool 2 you unlock a card called the Collector, and this deck the bones of this deck, which is currently the pool 1 deck, adding in Collector makes this so much stronger, this deck, and much more consistent as well. So definitely worth playing through into pool 2 as you get there as well. We take Cyclops from the bottom of their deck, so it looks like they're going to be a Patriot deck, which is interesting. Let's go ahead and get Ant-Man out into X Mansion. Do I want to do that? I think we do have it is a 6 power Cyclops, so actually not too bad at all. We could potentially just get some power down in. That's kind of. Let's go ahead and get Cyclops out in into the middle. I'll keep Ant-Man in hand. Ant-Man's much easier to fit on curve. We potentially do have a double Iron Man here with the Moon Girl as well. So that's so confusing. So what actually happened this turn was he debris, and X Mansion drew me a debris, which is just incredibly unfortunate for us in terms of the board space. I think our Iron Man is going to be our best bet here. I don't even know. I don't know. This is a bit of a crazy game, this one. So they've got a Khazar, and they're going to have a Patriot coming down. Ooh, this might be a tough one to win. I'm actually not sure how we win this. I mean, we can try. We can do our best, but I don't know how we actually win this one. Patriot and Shocker. So if you can figure out how to beat this, we can potentially figure out how to beat this. Okay, so let me do some calculations here. So we have to beat 12 here. So I think this actually might win. So we go to 7 here, which is going to take us to 14. He's capped out his board already. He's not playing a single thing. And we get Ant-Man out over here, which is going to win us the right lane. So I think we win this by 2 in left and a bunch in right. I'm going to lock this in. I think this is the play.
I am Iron Man.
We actually do end up winning this one. What an interesting game with the double debris. I would have thought it would have helped them out so much more than us, but we do end up getting out the win. Another win for a pool 1 deck. Great to see. So that's a wrap on the best decks you can be playing as a beginner in entering MarvelSNAP in pool 1. Really hope you enjoyed the video. We'll be streaming on the day of global launch, so stop by, say hi. Would love to see you in chat. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and until the next one, I'll see you then.